He was found buried under the ash of a burned world, surrounded by the charred remains of what used to be a nursery dome. The war had ended 3 days earlier, but its echoes still haunted the air, humming energy pulses, scorched steel, and the distant cries of survivors. He didn't cry, didn't move. Just stared at the cracked dome above him with wide, golden eyes that never blinked. The medics almost left him there, assuming he was dead. But the scanner beeped once, soft and strange, and that was the only reason he made it onto the transport. His species called themselves the Lorak, and they were known across the systems for their cold symmetry, beauty, and discipline. Everything about their civilization prized balance and perfection. Any deviation was considered not just a flaw, but a curse. That's why the baby was left behind. His skin was wrinkled and discolored, his limbs mismatched in length, and his jaw protruded oddly, giving him a lopsided expression. No one knew whether his deformities were due to genetics, war damage, or a failed mutation, and no one cared enough to ask. Once processed, he was handed over to the Galactic Orphan Custodial Center, listed under severe deformity, unknown compatibility, not recommended for adoption. His file contained no real name, just a designation, transcends 73 Delta. They kept him in a separate unit, far from the other orphans. Nurses rotated weekly. No one wanted to stay longer than they had to. He didn't cry, didn't smile, didn't reach out for comfort. There were thousands of orphaned children in the wake of the war, and most species treated them with solemn duty. Adoption was encouraged, publicized, rewarded. Governments ran campaigns to inspire empathy. But this one child? His file was opened, skimmed, and discarded again and again. Every prospective parent, across hundreds of species, swiped past his image with a quick glance and an unspoken shiver. He wasn't just different. He was uncomfortable to look at. Unnatural. One counselor from the Recollective wrote in a report, "He gives the sensation of being watched by something not meant to exist." Another from the Vectari Diplomatic League simply stated, "No viable social integration anticipated. Avoid future inquiry." So he waited. Days turned into weeks. Then into months. Staff tried to diagnose him, to explain why he didn't respond like others. Why he was so silent, so aware. They scanned his brain, measured his vitals, ran telepathic probes, most of which he shut out, not with aggression, but silence so absolute it terrified the specialists. One counselor described it as falling into a mental vacuum. But he was healthy. By every medical standard, he was alive and stable. Just alone. And alone he remained. Until a routine quarterly protocol triggered the automated transmission of all pending orphan files to member systems. Hundreds of thousands of files, thousands of planets. XN 73 Delta's image went with them, his golden eyes, his uneven mouth, that strange gaze that never looked into the camera but seemed to pierce through it. The file came through Earth's orphan intake servers like it had with the rest. But unlike others, the human algorithm flagged his case as high empathy required, unusual rejection pattern. An alert was sent to a Terran Department of Veteran Social Services, where a man named Mark Reynolds opened the file over morning coffee. At first, he didn't think much of it. Another case in a galaxy full of abandoned kids. But something in the picture made him pause. Not the deformity. Not the strangeness. It was the eyes. They reminded him of someone. Someone he missed every day since the accident that took her. His daughter had once looked at him like that, quiet, broken, asking for nothing, but needing everything. The memory hit him harder than he expected. He closed the file. Got up. Walked out of the room. But the face followed him. For hours. Through every thought. Every silence. By midnight he opened the file again. Scanned the notes. Read the rejection history. 57 species had denied even reviewing it. 3 marked it as cursed. The child had been in the system for over a year with no contact. Mark didn't send a message. He sent a petition. A direct request to Earth's Adoption Council. Attached was a single line, asterisk. If no one else will, I will. Asterisk. The initial reply was formal and dismissive. The case in question falls outside the human orphan integration range. But he didn't stop. He called, wrote, filed formal challenges. 3 weeks passed. Then 6. The media picked it up, asterisk. Veteran wants to adopt alien baby others call a monster. Asterisk. The comment sections were brutal. Some accused him of trying to exploit the child for attention. Others questioned the morality of raising something not even its own species wanted. But Mark ignored all of it. His only interview was brief. The reporter asked why he was doing this. Mark looked at the camera, his face hard, voice low. Because no child should have to grow up knowing they were unloved. Not if I can help it. The final approval came not from the Council, but from the Interstellar Rights Committee. A clause in the Terran Compassion Mandate gave humans the right to override xenophobic denials in special cases. The child was cleared for transport. When they brought the baby into the room, he didn't move. Just stared again, those same golden eyes locked on Mark. There was no moment of warmth. No sudden bond. Just silence. But Mark walked over, knelt down, and held out his hand. Hey there, kid, he said quietly. I'm Mark. I guess I'm gonna be your dad. The baby tilted his head, reached out, and touched Mark's hand. For the first time in his life, the child closed his eyes. Not from fear. Not from pain. From peace. The transition wasn't easy for either of them. In the first few weeks, Mark struggled with the silence. It wasn't the silence of an infant, the kind that a parent would expect. This was different. It was as though the child had no need to express himself, no desire to vocalize or reach out. He simply observed. Always. The golden eyes were a constant, always watching, always understanding something that Mark didn't. Mark was familiar with silence, having spent years alone in the aftermath of his wife's passing, but this silence felt heavier, laden with an intelligence that was almost alien. Mark did his best to keep his thoughts in check, to force himself into some semblance of routine. He began reading aloud, hoping that the sound of his voice would break the isolation that surrounded the child. He didn't know what it was that had called him to take this child in. After all, he had no experience with extraterrestrial species, let alone a malformed, rejected one. But somehow, he felt that something in the child needed him as much as he needed the child. His heart told him to persist, but logic screamed at him to quit. Yet every time the child looked at him, Mark felt something unspoken, a connection he couldn't understand. The first breakthrough came when the child, whose name was still nothing more than a number, reached out one morning, small and trembling, to touch Mark's face. It wasn't a sudden gesture. It was slow and deliberate. Mark had been sitting at the table, sipping coffee, when the small hand appeared before him. He froze, unsure of what was happening. He had seen the child touch things before, but this was different. This was purposeful. It was the first time the child initiated contact, and Mark felt his heart race. The child's touch was soft but cold. It was as if he had never known warmth before. As if he had never been allowed to feel human connection. Mark wanted to speak, but his words failed him. Instead, he reached out and allowed the child's hand to rest on his cheek. The touch lingered, and in that moment, Mark realized that this small, broken being had no concept of love. No understanding of what it meant to be held, cared for, or protected. In the following weeks, Mark kept the routine going. He would bring the child to the park in the mornings, and they would sit on the swings. People stared. It was impossible to ignore the grotesque nature of the child's appearance, but Mark didn't care. He could see the child's small eyes scanning the world, processing the environment. His mind seemed so sharp, so intelligent. There was something profound behind those eyes, something beyond the mere fact of survival. But the other children? They didn't approach. They kept their distance, eyes wide in fear or curiosity. One afternoon, a group of children pointed at the child and laughed. Mark didn't hear what they were saying, but the child did. His golden eyes widened in shock and something akin to fear flickered across his face. Mark didn't know what the child understood, but the hurt was obvious. His small hands curled into fists, and for the first time, he made a sound, a guttural, almost feral growl that startled Mark. Mark pulled the child closer, holding him tightly as if he could somehow shield him from the cruelty of the world. "It's okay," Mark whispered, though he knew the words meant little. The child didn't react to them. The incident had been a stark reminder of what the world thought of this being, a rejection that Mark couldn't change, no matter how much he wished to. The next day, Mark took the child to the shelter of his apartment. He had kept the windows closed since the laughter, the sounds of the world outside ringing too loudly in the child's ears. Inside, it was quieter, calmer, and there was less to be afraid of. Mark knew the child needed to learn, to adapt, but the cruelty of the outside world wasn't something he could prepare the child for. Still, there was a growing bond between them. Despite the coldness that seemed to radiate from the child, Mark began to see the subtle shifts in his behavior. The child started mimicking Mark's actions, following his movements with a quiet intensity. When Mark would smile, the child would do his best to form a lopsided version of a smile. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to break Mark's heart every time. The child was trying. He was learning. And that was more than anyone else had ever given him credit for. Then, one evening, something changed. Mark had been working on his personal project, a mechanical device that he had been tinkering with for months, when he felt the presence of the child. The small, lopsided smile was there, but now, the child was holding something in his hands, something small, shiny. It was a broken piece of the device Mark had been working on, a part that had fallen to the floor earlier. The child had picked it up, studied it, and, without any prompting, was now trying to fix it. Mark stared, a sense of awe creeping over him. The child, despite his deformities, was trying to repair something. His movements were deliberate, focused. He wasn't playing with the device out of curiosity, or to pass the time, he was genuinely trying to understand it. Mark felt his heart beat faster, a rush of pride swelling within him. In that moment, he realized that the child wasn't just some helpless, abandoned being. He was intelligent, capable, and, most importantly, he was learning to trust. Trust Mark. And that trust was a gift. The next few months were a blur of growth and adaptation. Mark's days were filled with the struggle of teaching the child, of learning to communicate in ways that went beyond words. But with every passing day, Mark saw the child become more than just a creature of silence. He became a companion, a partner, and in his own way, a son. They learned from each other. Mark, the grieving father, found purpose once again. The child, rejected by his own kind, began to discover what it meant to be loved. Yet, in the back of Mark's mind, there was always the fear that the child's deformities would be too much for the world to accept. That one day, they would face rejection together. But Mark wasn't about to let that happen. The world might reject them, but in that small apartment, they had each other. And that was enough. In the quiet moments, when the world outside seemed distant and the only sound was the rhythm of Mark's breathing and the soft patter of the child's movements, Mark realized that the love he felt for this being, this alien, this broken soul, was more powerful than anything he had ever known. It was unconditional. It was fierce. It was everything. As the weeks went by, Mark found himself growing more protective, more attached to the alien child. He had never expected to bond with the creature so deeply, but there it was, a connection that had grown beyond the simple act of caretaking. The child had changed his life in ways Mark couldn't have anticipated, and yet he still couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. He wasn't sure what it was, but there was a dark presence hanging in the air whenever he thought about the future. Perhaps it was the fear of rejection, the fear that one day, someone would come to take the child away from him. Or maybe it was the constant weight of the world outside their little sanctuary, always ready to judge, to cast away those who didn't fit in. Mark had read about the world's reaction to extraterrestrial life. He had seen how humanity had handled first contact with alien species. Some were embraced, but most, especially those like his son, were viewed as lesser or unnatural. The news outlets, the pundits, the governments, They all loved to talk about progress and coexistence. But deep down, Mark knew the truth. Not all aliens were welcomed. And his son, this beautiful, broken child, was one of the outcasts. The truth was harder to ignore now that the child had started growing. He wasn't an infant anymore. He was starting to develop in ways that Mark didn't fully understand. His strange, alien features were becoming more pronounced, and with every passing day, it felt like the child was becoming more of a stranger to him. The way his face morphed, changing from one grotesque shape to another, only served to remind Mark that the world would never accept him. Still, Mark didn't care. He couldn't bring himself to stop caring. When he looked into the child's eyes, the golden orbs that reflected a mind far older than its years, he saw the loneliness. He saw the same pain that had lived in him for years after losing his wife. The child wasn't just an alien. He was a soul, just like him, lost and seeking something to hold on to. It was during one of their quiet nights, when Mark was sitting on the couch, trying to calm his nerves, that the child did something he had never done before. He reached out and touched Mark's hand. His small, cold fingers wrapped around Mark's, a simple gesture that made Mark's heart race. The child didn't speak, didn't make any sound. But there was something in the way he held on to Mark, as if he were asking for protection, for safety, for love. It was a silent plea that Mark could no longer ignore. Mark didn't know how to explain it, but in that moment, he understood. The child was scared. He wasn't just some alien experiment, or some oddity in Mark's life. He was living, breathing, feeling. He had his own fears, his own desires, his own needs. The rejection he had suffered, the isolation he had lived through, it was something Mark could relate to. But Mark also realized something else that night. The child didn't deserve to face the same fate that he had. He wouldn't allow it. The next day, Mark made a decision that would change everything. It wasn't enough to just protect the child in their little bubble of safety. It wasn't enough to hide away and pretend the world didn't exist. He had to find a way for the child to have a life. A real one. And that meant going outside, facing the dangers of a society that would never understand, and doing everything in his power to make sure the child wasn't alone in the world. He began reaching out, contacting government agencies, scientific institutions, even the media. He was met with the same resistance, the same closed doors. He was told that the child was too much of a risk, too unpredictable, and that the world wasn't ready for him. But Mark refused to give up. He knew the world could change. He knew that with time and effort he could show them that the child was worthy of acceptance. Then, one fateful evening, when Mark thought he couldn't fight anymore, something unexpected happened. A group of people, scientists, sociologists, and human rights activists, arrived at his doorstep. They had heard his story, seen the media coverage, and they were ready to listen. These weren't just people interested in studying the alien child. They were people who genuinely wanted to help, to advocate for his right to live freely, to exist outside the shadows of fear and hate. The initial meeting was tense. The child didn't speak, of course, but the tension in the room was palpable. Mark could feel the weight of judgment in every word, every question. But he stood firm. He explained that the child was more than just a specimen, or a curiosity. He was his son, and he deserved to live a life that wasn't defined by rejection. He was learning, growing, and showing signs of emotional intelligence that no one had expected. One of the scientists, a woman named Dr. Harper, asked Mark about the child's origins, his species, and how he had come to be. Mark didn't have answers. All he knew was that the child had been abandoned, cast aside by those who were supposed to care for him. The child didn't fit into their mold of what an alien should be, so he had been thrown away. Dr. Harper nodded slowly, her expression softening. "He's not unlike us, is he?" she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Just looking for a place to belong. Just looking for someone to love him." Mark's heart skipped a beat. It was as if she had spoken the words he had been too afraid to say aloud. He wasn't alone in this fight. There were people who understood. Over the next few months, the efforts to secure a place for the child in society intensified. Mark worked tirelessly, advocating for the child, educating the public, fighting against the prejudices that had plagued the world's perception of alien life. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, roadblocks, and moments of crushing defeat. But with every step forward, the child grew stronger, more confident. And Mark, for the first time in years, felt a sense of purpose that wasn't defined by his own grief or fears. The breakthrough came when an international human rights group took up the cause. They began pushing for a new law, one that would protect alien children like Mark's, giving them the right to grow up without fear of exploitation, rejection, or abuse. It was a long battle, but Mark had never felt more determined. He wasn't just fighting for his son. He was fighting for every outcast, every being who had ever been cast aside because they didn't fit in. When the law passed, it was a victory, but it wasn't the end of the journey. Mark knew that true acceptance would take time. The world had to change, and that change started with individuals like him. People who were willing to stand up for what was right, even in the face of overwhelming odds. And in the end, Mark didn't care how the world saw his son. He had already seen the truth. The child was his family. His son. And no matter what, he would fight for him. The moment of truth arrived with a harshness that Mark couldn't have anticipated. Despite all the progress he had made, the child's very existence was still a point of contention for many. It wasn't just the question of his origin, it was his presence in a world that hadn't yet come to terms with alien life, especially not one that defied the conventional expectations of what such beings should look like. The child, with his odd features, was not just a curiosity, he was a symbol, an embodiment of all the discomfort, fear, and prejudice that humanity had long buried under the surface. But Mark had made a promise. He had promised that he would do everything he could to make sure the child was given a chance. He had become so immersed in that promise that, at times, it felt as though the whole world was against them. There were moments when the weight of it all nearly crushed him, the endless calls from the press, the protests outside his home, the constant questioning of his motives. Yet, every time he looked at the child, something inside him told him to push forward. The child had no voice, no way of defending himself, and that's where Mark came in. Despite the overwhelming odds, there were small victories. Conversations with activists and scientists began to show some real progress. The voices advocating for the rights of alien children grew louder. But it wasn't fast enough. Mark had expected the world to take longer to accept his son, but what he hadn't prepared for was the overwhelming fear that others had of the unknown. And while it might have been easy to blame the government or the media, Mark knew deep down that the fear was far more deeply ingrained than that. It was a human instinct to fear the unknown, and the child represented everything humanity didn't understand. Still, Mark wasn't a man who could back down. He had faced the tragedy of losing his wife, the crushing loneliness that followed, and now, he was facing a different kind of grief. He wasn't just trying to protect his son from those who saw him as a monster. He was trying to protect the child from a world that wasn't ready for him. But he would never stop fighting. It was one of those days when Mark was feeling particularly defeated, facing yet another barrage of hateful remarks on social media and dealing with another closed door from an advocacy group, that the phone call came. It was from Dr. Harper, the scientist who had helped them find their first glimmer of hope. She was calling to inform him that the law they had worked so hard for, the law that would protect alien children like his son, had hit a major roadblock. The opposition had become too strong, too vocal, and it seemed as though the law was about to be delayed indefinitely. Mark's heart sank as he listened to her words. He had hoped that their hard work, their sacrifices, would make a difference. But in that moment, he realized how deeply the world feared change. How deep-seated the prejudice was. And how little the child had in terms of allies. But Dr. Harper wasn't giving up. She spoke to him in a way that only someone who had dedicated their life to change could. "You know what you're up against," she said, her voice steady despite the news. "But you also know that this is a fight worth having. We're not backing down. We're not going to stop until we make this right." Mark nodded, even though he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going. But there was something about her words, the confidence and the fire in her voice, that sparked something in him. It was that same fire that had kept him going all these months. He wasn't just fighting for a child. He was fighting for a future where acceptance wasn't something earned, but something given. He was fighting for the world to see what he had seen from the beginning, a child who needed love, who deserved a chance. As Mark hung up the phone, he sat quietly for a long time, staring at the wall in front of him. He could hear the child in the next room, making small, strange noises, as if playing with something he couldn't quite understand. And in that moment, Mark realized the truth that had eluded him for so long. The world may not have been ready for his son, but his son was ready for the world. He wasn't just an alien, a freak of nature. He was a child with dreams, with feelings, with hopes. And Mark would make sure the world saw him for what he was. The fight was far from over. But Mark knew that he couldn't back down now. He had made a promise to the child, to himself, and to his late wife, who had always dreamed of a world where love, acceptance, and understanding ruled. Even though the path ahead was uncertain and filled with obstacles, Mark understood that he had to stay true to his word. He had to continue the fight, even when the road felt impossible to travel. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Mark and the child had become something of a symbol, whether they wanted it or not. The media, the activists, and the public at large kept their eyes on them, watching their every move. But with that attention came new challenges. The pressure, the scrutiny, it was relentless. But through it all, Mark's resolve remained unshaken. There were small victories. The law was reintroduced, with new provisions and stronger support. The media, once dismissive, began to shift their tone, recognizing that this wasn't just a story about an alien child. It was a story about humanity, about what it meant to be truly compassionate, to truly accept others despite their differences. Mark never stopped advocating for his son, for the children like him, and for the future he had promised to build. But as the battle continued, something profound began to happen. The world began to change. Slowly but surely, the world began to see the child not as an outsider, but as a part of something bigger, something more important than anyone could have imagined. Mark knew that the world might never fully accept the child, or others like him, but it didn't matter. They had already won. The victory wasn't in the law or the public's acceptance. The victory was in the truth: the child was loved. He was wanted. And in Mark's heart, that was all that mattered. The weight of the world felt lighter as the days passed, yet the journey was far from over. Mark had seen firsthand the battle that came with raising an alien child in a world that wasn't ready for him. But through every obstacle, he had been resolute. No matter how many doors were slammed in his face, how many eyes glared with suspicion or hate, Mark had kept his promise. His son was more than just an alien to him. He was his child, his responsibility, and the embodiment of a future that transcended the prejudices of the past. And in those quiet moments, when the world outside was silent, Mark would look at the child and wonder, how long before the world truly accepted him? How long before others saw the innocence in the child's eyes, the same innocence Mark had fought so hard to protect? He didn't have all the answers. No one did. But he did know one thing: they couldn't stop fighting. Not now, not ever. The pressure was never-ending. It wasn't just about being a father to a child who was seen as a symbol. It was about being the face of something much larger than either of them. And yet, Mark never faltered. Every protest, every demonstration of hatred toward his son made him more determined. The louder the opposition became, the stronger his resolve grew. He had no other choice but to keep going. For the child, for the future, for humanity itself. And there were those moments when things began to change, very slowly, but undeniably. The small victories mattered. They had made a significant impact on the political landscape. A senator, once a fierce opponent of the child's right to live freely, had seen the child in person. The encounter, while brief, had been enough to soften his hardened stance. It wasn't a full transformation, but it was a step forward. Another victory came when a previously hostile media outlet aired a special feature on Mark and his son. It wasn't glowing, But it was the first time the story had been told from a perspective that wasn't driven by fear or sensationalism. Mark had always believed that the truth could set things right. He understood that not everyone would come around, not everyone would ever be able to see the child for who he truly was, but every inch of progress mattered. They were making the world see that the child was not some threat, some aberration, but a living, breathing testament to the possibility of understanding, of acceptance, and of love. That was the message he and his son were sending, whether the world was ready for it or not. Despite the progress, there was still a long road ahead. Mark knew that the challenges they faced weren't going away anytime soon. Fear, after all, didn't disappear overnight. It was ingrained in the very fabric of human nature, something that had been passed down through generations. But fear could be overcome. It could be dismantled, piece by piece. And he was determined to be a part of that process. He couldn't do it alone, but he didn't need to. There were others, activists, scientists, ordinary people who believed in what he and his son were doing. Together, they were a force that couldn't be ignored. But for all the progress, the hatred was still out there. It hadn't gone away. It still loomed over them like a dark cloud, threatening to rain on their hard-earned victories. The online hate campaigns had only grown more virulent. Every day brought new threats, new calls for the child's removal from society. And yet, Mark refused to be intimidated. There was no time for fear, no time to cower. If the world couldn't accept the child, then they would force the world to accept the truth. It was difficult not to feel the weight of the attacks, not to question the long-term consequences of raising a child in such a volatile environment. Mark was only human. But when he looked at his son, his heart swelled with a fierce love that made the fear seem insignificant. He could endure anything, bear any hardship, as long as the child was with him. The child's smile, the way he laughed at the simplest of things, made everything else fade away. And then it came. The moment they had been waiting for, the breakthrough. It wasn't a grand announcement, or a single defining moment. It was the accumulation of all the small steps, the conversations, the gestures of goodwill, and the quiet determination that had built up over time. The law passed. It was a hard-fought victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The alien child had been granted the same rights as any human child, with protections that would ensure his safety and well-being. The news spread like wildfire, first in whispers, then in shouts of triumph. The victory wasn't just Mark's and his son's, it was a victory for all of humanity. It was proof that, despite everything, people could change. They could overcome their fears, their biases, their hatred. They could choose to accept what was different instead of fearing it. In the aftermath of the victory, Mark found himself overwhelmed. There had been moments when he doubted it would ever happen, when he had questioned his decision to take this journey. But now, standing in the wake of all that they had accomplished, he understood something profound. The battle wasn't just about winning laws or changing the system. It was about changing hearts. And with every heart that changed, the world became just a little bit more humane. The next step was simple yet monumental. Mark knew that it wasn't enough to win the law, to win the battle. The real challenge was in maintaining the progress, in ensuring that the world didn't forget what had been achieved. He was determined to keep fighting, not just for his son, but for every child who would come after him. It wasn't over. It couldn't be. The world had to see the child for who he truly was, not an alien, not a symbol of fear, but a child. And Mark would make sure that no one ever forgot that. In the end, the victory was more than just a legal triumph. It was a victory for love, for compassion, and for the future. It was a victory that proved that humanity, when it came together, could overcome anything, even the darkest fears. And for Mark, there was no greater victory than that.